Yes, hello and good morning. Good morning. We are live. And for the remainder of this ordeal, we are live from Casa de Horton. Mr. Turner talked a little bit about it, and the principals alluded to it a little bit. But, yesterday I came to you from back at Ryle, and about 11:30 or so, I was made aware of the fact that because the governor's directive that I and none of the teachers, in fact, could no longer be actually in the building at Ryle. So going forward from now on, all of these broadcasts will come to you from here. Fortunately, though, I have an able technical staff, Senor Horton and Senor Horton, who seems to be taking a snooze back there. But yes, okay. Before we get started talking about political experiments of the 1920s, let's talk about your future. Beginning with, I don't know if you keep up with the news as much as I do. Seems there's been an awful lot of news. All the channels have extended their broadcast, and rightfully so. The Senate passed the aid package last night, which is good news for a lot of people. This coronavirus is damaging the economy and putting a whole lot of people in a bad way. Joseph Stalin used to say that the death of one person is a tragedy. The death of 1,000,000 people is a statistic. I guess you could kind of also say something like that to concerning person losing their job, losing their income, or something like that. And right now we have a lot of tragedies and a whole lot of statistics going on in this country. And so, yeah, the fact that the Senate passed that aid package will be of some help. Although for a lot of people, hourly workers, et cetera, however long they have to wait for that first check will be a long time. So I do think about them as well as, of course, the people who are affected by this disease. Although, and I hate to be Debbie Downer. I mean, it is Thankful Thursday, but I hate to be Debbie Downer, but probably to me, the most disturbing news that I heard in the past 12 hours was the idea that this COVID-19 coronavirus, whatever you want to call it, could be seasonal. In other words, this is terrible. What we're doing now is terrible. But the idea is, if it's seasonal, in other words, it could come back. So we really need to have that vaccine. Yes. But, we are in school. Now, more news that is more personal to you about this course. I know I've been getting on your cases a lot lately. Please, once again, remember that tomorrow from 7 o'clock in the morning until 11:59 in the p.m. that you have a quiz. And to be honest, the quiz tomorrow, it's a World Civ quiz that I made up for teaching World Civ. I don't think it's that difficult. Now, the test you are going to have Monday, which I'll be working on, which will appear on Canvas as well in the quizzes, that will be more difficult. I would say to those people who probably are not listening, because yesterday we had 50 views, and I do know that 50 views just means that somebody turned me on and turned me off, and that's true. I'm not saying all of you did that, of course not, but you know, there are some people out there who, oh, click, I'm checking in, and then that's all they do, and that's all they say. You know, if you're listening, we have a test Monday, which will count for more points. And I will tell you that for this quiz tomorrow and the test Monday, I will be a lot less forgiving about people who, for some reason, think that this is an extension of summer vacation, an early spring break, because it's not. We'll have a spring break. We will have a spring break in 10 days. And I intend, for the most part, to leave you alone then. I really do. You know, but right now we have school. And the state of Kentucky pays for that school. Your parents pay for that school. And we will have school. And like I said, I hate to be Debbie Downer all the time, but this is school. And so let's see, announcements. Yes, we're having a test Monday, as well as the quiz tomorrow. Now, what will the test be like? Well, it'll have the matching section that we normally have. So therefore, your terms that we've went over are very important. Dreikaiserbund, Article 237 of the Versailles Treaty, the risk theory. Remember those? They're in your terms. Things of that nature. So you need to be diligent about, you know, compiling that list of terms, figuring out what they mean. Yeah, because there will be 26 matching questions. And the test will also depend heavily upon the take-home test, which you also have in your possession. And so, yeah, you have an entire weekend to begin working on that. But the quiz tomorrow should be, it should be much, much simpler. Okay. So now that I've done that, I've spent 7 minutes doing that, let's talk about this new unit, which I'm pulling up right now. Political experiments of the 1920s. So, political experiments, political movements, you know, these are things, you know, one of the reasons why that they divided the AP Euro and most history courses are divided from, you know, in the last section begins in 1914, is because World War I is really, really, really going to reshape not just Europe, but the entire globe. And the changes brought on by World War I, we still feel them today. So, Roman numeral I. Political experimental regimes dotted across Eastern and Western Europe. In other words, after the war, there was a tremendous feeling of disillusionment. And so, and popular politics of large numbers of people having the right to vote was relatively new. The press and large numbers of people being able to read was relatively new. And so public opinion, and I say relatively new, you couldn't ignore public opinion anymore. And the most of the great monarchies of Europe had been struck down. And so something has to fill in and take up those power vacuums. And so this is what happens in the next 20 years, these new political regimes. In Russia, the Bolsheviks, who are still a fledgling government, but they're every year gaining more and more control over this new country. It becomes the Soviet Union in 1922. Yes, Russia becomes the Soviet Union in 1922. I'm sorry, my eyes are watering. In some countries, liberal democracies gave the right to vote to many women and formerly voteless males. In other words, males who had never voted for. And once again, that's, in and of and by itself, that sounds really wonderful. But, the right to vote is a tremendous responsibility, and as well as a tremendous freedom. And for people who have never had any experience with the right to vote, with deciding their own future, deciding the future of their countries, I mean, it is understandable why a lot of these extremist political movements came into power. Democratically elected parliaments reigned in the former dictatorships and monarchies. And as we already know, Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which features prominently not only in tomorrow's quiz, but also in the upcoming test, is 14 points. And remember, I gave you that summation of what the 14 points were. Open agreements openly arrived at, freedom of trade and navigation. Just got a dress barn advertisement. I'm so thankful. Freedom of trade and navigation. Oh yes, self-determination, that all ethnicities should rule themselves, and finally the League of Nations. So that, once again, if you want to know what the 14 points are, there they are, and they will come back and haunt you. Wilson's 14-point idea of democracy and self-determination ran into harsh reality. That harsh reality was represented by primarily the Prime Minister and the President, Prime Minister of Great Britain and the President of France. The British and French were out to make the world a better place for Britain and France after World War I. Overall, liberal, idealistic, parliamentary, and democratic policies faded in the face of reality. Okay. Now, once again, here's the difference between liberal democratic governments and authoritarian governments. What is the big difference? What is the appeal of an authoritarian government? Well, it's like this. Now, you saw over the past few days that, I don't know, when this coronavirus first hit, that the president suggested some form of economic aid package. They named a figure, and it took the Senate. Remember, our government is just like a giant committee. Our legislature is a giant committee of 535 guys. It's hard to get two guys to agree to do one thing. I mean, think about it. You ever went out to eat with your family back in the days when you could go out to eat in your family, like when you're on vacation, and somebody says, well, where do you want to eat? And, suddenly at first some people are saying, I don't know. Others, I don't want to eat Chinese again. Oh, do we? And, the kids chime out, pizza, and I am not having pizza, And so that's the weakness of democracy, in that if you need direct, decisive action, a democracy is not a good way to get it. And that's the advantage of authoritarian governments. Authoritarian governments say, we're going to go this way, and that's it. And in times of crisis, there is an appeal to authoritarian governments, which is another reason why these new authoritarian governments, the fascists, the communists, the other strict regimes, began to have appeal because they could get something done now. And so liberal, idealistic, parliamentary, and democratic policies began to look inefficient in front of these more authoritarian regimes who could do things now. Roman II. In Paris, of course, the Treaty of Versailles stirred great controversy. Germany was totally humiliated, and I can't remember. So if you see on your test reference to Article 231 or Article 237. I can never remember the number. I think it's Article 237. But it both mean, for me and to you, it means the same thing. The war guilt clause. The war guilt clause, which said that this entire fiasco of World War I, this entire fiasco was Germany's fault. And so, if I put down Article 231, Mr. Lynn, and it's Article 237, don't yell at me or call me out or say my teacher's incompetent. Well, we'll see, Mr. Lynn. But yes, so Article 231, and Germany, remember, had to sign this. We caused the war. The war is our fault. We're responsible for paying for the whole thing. Yeah, Germany was totally humiliated. Then, of course, there was haggling over the war reparation payments. And after they finished haggling over how much, they haggled over the Germans' ability to pay them. Many Eastern European countries demanded redrawing their borders to address self-determination and nationalization. And the French were always willing to say that the Treaty of Versailles was not being enforced, at least not to their liking. So, caffeine, right? There was a desire to return to the pre-war prosperity, of course, but because of the massive amounts of resources poured into the war effort, that was not going to happen right away. Plus, and I'll mention this later on, but it's a good thing to remember now, plus Britain and France really hitched the future of their economies to Germany's ability to pay for the war, because Britain and France owed tremendous amounts of money to, guess who? The United States of America, because the United States of America had, supplied the great majority of the weapons and munitions that were utilized in World War I. And so, that was a great weakness in the economies of Britain and France. So, Roman numeral 3, Part A, what had been normal prior to World War I could not be reestablished. There was not going to be a going back to the era when Europe just ran the world. That was not going to happen. Even the victor countries had been destabilized. And then there was this thing called communism. And speaking of communism, which we will later on, if you've ever read the book Animal Farm by George Orwell, all animals are created equal, but some animals are more equal than others. That was about the rise of communism in Russia. Like I said, we'll get to that later. But the point of the matter is that what was once normal, what was normal in Europe in 1913 was not going to be reestablished. I mean, Europe was not going to be the dominant power that it once was. Britain had lost 750,000 soldiers. France had lost 1,385,000 soldiers. Germany 1,808,000 soldiers. And Russia 1,700,000 soldiers. And once again, they're called the lost generation. In other words, and I've made reference to this many times before, that in some towns in those countries I just mentioned, were totally devoid of males after World War I. There were no males between the ages of 17 and 50. Many more than that number I just ran off to you were wounded, and I don't mean just wounded physically, which so many were, blinded, amputations, but many were, I've never seen war myself. I hope never to see it. I hope you never see it. But you can't just go back home after you've been in a place where you see people killed around you and you yourself probably have killed people, and then just go back home and sleep like a baby. Human beings just have a tremendous difficult time with that. You have with the returning veterans, they're not the same people they used to be. You know, heaven help them, heaven help their families. They're not the same people. There, of course, are the nightmares. My first cousin, who lost his leg in Vietnam in 1969, I believe, guarding a hospital outside of Saigon, stepped on a mine, and you know, he had nightmares for a long time, and they never go away. You say, well, how do you cope? Well, eventually you start making peace with them. You make friends with them, like other tragedies I could mention. So they were wounded not only physically, they were wounded spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. And that means also that they just weren't productive citizens like they used to be. You know, this represented not only a loss of life, but also a loss of production and consumption, producers and consumers. European nations were deeply in debt to each other, but particularly the United States. The new communist regime in Russia repudiated the debt of the Tsarist family. That debt was owed to other Western nations. And the communists just said, we're not paying it. Anyway, the United States did not ask war reparations of Germany. Interesting. But they did ask debt payment of their allies. That didn't make the British and French very happy. Will you excuse me a moment? Forgive me. Allergies. My wife is all worried. Where's my hand sanitizer? My wife is all very worried because she has something of a cough this morning. And she was worried the other day because I have allergies and I'm sneezing. You know, it is still primavera, spring, and springtime you have allergies. So back to the matter at hand. So yeah, the United States, they didn't ask war reparations of Germany, but they demanded that the British and French pay their debts, which, like I said, didn't really endear the U.S. to the British and the French. And once the war was over with, shoe carnival. Yeah. Once the war was over with, all the nations, you know, their common cause was gone. They wanted to go back to their own goals, their own normal economic, their own interest. No nation at all was in control of its own economic life. I mean, for example, the United States economy also depended on the British and French paying their debt payments. The British and French, to a large degree, depended on the Germans paying their debt payments. And of course, the Germans, they had been racked by World War I, and so it was like, where's that money coming from? More nations became wrapped up in their own nationalistic goals, and that's a recipe for return to war. The new small states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia. The new states were often not economically viable. You know, I mean, all the people living in those countries I just mentioned had long been saying, we want our own country, we want our own country. Well, now they have their own country, and now they have to run it. And now they have to take care of things like economic interests. They have to have an economic infrastructure. And like I mentioned before, the creation of these new nations also set up borders, artificial borders, which prevented the transportation of resources across. You know, for example, if you had coal mines over here in what becomes Czechoslovakia, and coal production, rather steel making plants that needs lots of coal, say in one of the other countries, Hungary, for example. And that's a bad example, but to ship steel or to ship coal from one country to the other, you have to pass the border. And at the border, you must stop and it must be inspected. You must pay a tariff. And in all these new countries, they all got new currencies, for example. I mean, yes, now they're independent, but now their new economies are, to be honest, it's like Brexit. I'm sure many people in Britain are now much more favorable towards Brexit than they used to be. But at the same, because Brexit, one of the things that Brexit does is to keep your other Europeans out of Great Britain, out of the UK. But it also is a hindrance to trade. Touching my face to death, I'm sorry. So, as it says there, the new boundaries hamper trade by disconnecting raw materials from factories and cut across both rail and railroad lines. European dominance over the world economy obviously weakened, and the United States became less dependent upon European-made goods, and was now a major competitors. The Europeans had sold off many investments during the war, and the United States and Japan began to penetrate the Latin American markets, which previously had been dominated by Britain, to be honest. Okay, Roman numeral 4. The war had given organized labor unions, new providence. In other words, it gave them a leg up. The workers figured out that because they produce a lot of valuable material, particularly in wartime, that with that value comes power, the ability to negotiate, the ability to gain concessions. The middle class, of course, became suspicious of the labor movement, and the middle class, became more conservative. Socialism of the Soviet Union, which becomes communism, took control of a large part of Asia and retained that control until 1991. Socialism, communism, remember that communism is an extreme form of socialism. The Communist Party was neither a massive movement or a nationalistic one. That's a good stat. And less than 1% of the Russian population belonged to this new Communist Party that was going to be running things in Russia. After 1917, there was widespread opposition in Russia to the Communist Party. The communists felt that their party was the epoch-making event of world history, and should be exported around the world. Karl Marx called for worldwide revolution, and Lenin was a believer in Marxism with certain differences, but yeah, he thought that communism should be exported to the rest of the world. The Bolsheviks were, however, firmly implanted, as no force could destabilize the Bolsheviks, even though they were tiny, because the White Russians, the Bolsheviks were called the Red Russians, the Mensheviks were called the White Russians. The White Russians were the supporters of the old parliamentary government that had been set up right after World War I, well, right after the Tsar abdicated. Remember that when Tsar Nicholas II stepped down, they set up a fledgling Duma democratic government. Lasted only a short time. And then in 1917, a well-coordinated coup by the communists took power from the parliamentary government, which kicked off this revolution in Russia. A revolution that, like I said, many nations like Britain, the United States, France, and even Germany tried to help destabilize. And eventually, of course, the Bolsheviks win. So yes, Roman numeral 6, the Bolsheviks firmly implanted as no force could destabilize them at the time because the White Russians were not organized enough, and foreign help, including the polar bears of the United States, and the British and the French and the Germans, was not substantial enough. Under war communism, which was what the Communist Party set up during this war to better coordinate their resistance to the White Russians. The new government, the Communist government of Russia, confiscated banks, the transportation system, heavy industry. The state, the communists also seized grain from the farmers to feed the armies and the workers in the cities. Lenin could use the pretext of civil war to continue these atrocities. And when I say atrocities, they went to the farms and they said, give us your grain for the use of the government. And when the peasant farmers resisted, they were just shot. In 1920 and 1921, there were large strikes, meaning workers stopped working. Large strikes, where's that? Due to the resistance of the Bolsheviks, resistance to the Bolsheviks. The Alliance of Workers and Peasants used the slogan, peace, land, and bread. In March of 1921, the Russian fleet on the Baltic mutinied. The Red Army, though, crushed these activities and lots of people died. For the time being, it appeared that the Soviet Union would be an island of revolutionary communism in a sea of capitalism. Okay, Roman numeral 7. Lenin then, ever the pragmatist, comes forward with a new compromising economic policy. After the revolts, Lenin came forward with what it was called the NEP, the New Economic Policy. Apart from banking, transportation, international commerce, there would be some toleration of private economic enterprise. Some toleration of people working and keeping their money. Peasants could farm for profit. They would pay taxes, but they would also profit from extra grain sales. Lenin felt the Russian peasants would hold the key to the success of the Russian Revolution. The NEP was partially successful, the NEP, New Economic Program, but there were virtually no consumer goods for the peasants to purchase with their money from their grain. You see, and that's the thing. In communist governments, it's a constant thing that there is a lack of consumer goods, which causes me to think back to when this whole coronavirus thing got started. And I remember, it was a very eerie feeling to walk through the grocery stores looking for things and seeing empty shelves. That was something I had never seen in my life. Stores with empty shelves. But for the next 70 years, that will be pretty much a fact of life in communist states. Not just the Soviet Union, Russia became the Soviet Union, yes, but also in the Eastern Bloc countries. In 1989, I took that trip, a soccer trip. I remember we flew into Germany, and we flew into Munich first. And after we stayed in Munich for 4 days, we then got on a train and to go to Berlin. Now, Berlin, as we're going to learn one day, Berlin is located in East Germany, in communist Germany. And as we're going to find out, West Berlin was still a Western enclave. It was still a place where the West German government, was occupying the democratic government, the free market government. So we stayed in West Berlin for one night, and it was like an island of capitalism. Okay. And so our train took us into West Berlin, and that next day, we got a tour bus to go into East Berlin, which, we went into communist East Berlin to play this soccer match. And, West Berlin, staying there for that day and a half, West Berlin was like any other Western European cities. I mean, there were restaurants, open markets, discotheques open to all hours of the night. It was actually a thriving city. East Berlin, the transition going East Berlin was like, if you've ever had black and white television, it's like, watching black and white television and suddenly the color goes off on your television. Or if you've ever watched old black and white films, that's what it was like. And not only that, there was literally nothing to buy. So it didn't really matter how much money you made. There was nothing to buy on the shelves, which is kind of a feeling that I had a couple of weeks ago, searching around for hand sanitizer, but not just that, meats, canned goods, things of that nature. I don't even want to use the word toilet paper. That, of course, is all eventually going to right itself, but it was just eerie. Excuse me. But now we're on Roman numeral 7a, part 4. By 1927, industrial production had reached its 1913 levels. So 1913, that's actually a positive thing. Forgive me. This is one we can't be together in class. I'm going to sneeze. And, my sneezes are pretty powerful. It appeared, though, that Russia had become a large country of small shops and businesses. Lenin, though, was not well. He had a couple of strokes, which more and more debilitated him. And eventually he was on his deathbed. So with Lenin's death imminent, the battle for control over this new communist government came between Joseph Stalin who ironically had begun his career as a priest, literally. And Stalin's name, like Lenin's name, was a spy name. It was a false name. Stalin actually means man of steel. So yeah, interesting. And the former Red Army chief, Leon Trotsky. Lenin had a stroke in 1922, died in 1924. Lenin, it seemed, had criticized both men, but he especially didn't like Stalin. However, Stalin's power base, he was a much better politician than Leon Trotsky. The issue between Trotsky and Stalin was Russia's path towards industrialism. Trotsky, who was more left-wing, urged rapid industrialization through the export of farm products. Agriculture, he said, should be collectivized, which means that all the farmers should combine their resources. That's what collectivization means. You don't have a lot of little tiny farms. You have a group of farmers combining their resources, and that way they become more efficient. And also was in favor of exporting the revolution of the Communist Party. He said that party members should be able to criticize the government. Stalin, who was more conservative, was aided by Nikolai Bukharin, the editor of Pravda. Pravda, good word. Pravda, which, believe it or not, still exists today, is the official news. You can't find it anywhere just about in the United States, although back in the 1980s, you could go over here to Cincinnati and could buy a copy. Pravda is the official the official newspaper of the Communist Party. Pravda in Russian literally means truth. Stalin, pressed for the continuation of the new economic plan, relatively slow industrialization, a decentralized economic policy and some private industry. Stalin, however, was much more brutal about dispatching his opponents. Yeah, and we will see this. You know, in the 20th century, and people talk about mass murderers, when they talk about, you know, people who were the villains of the 20th century, of course, most of the attention is paid to Adolf Hitler. And Stalin gets a short shrift in that. Stalin killed somewhere in the neighborhood of 20, 30 million of his own people, starved many of them to death, sent many to Gulag in Siberia, where they died of malnutrition, ill treatment, and of course, just shot some of them. By some, I mean millions. Stalin amassed his power through his command of the bureaucratic and administrative method. In other words, Stalin was a better politician within the Communist Party. And the Communist Party, in the end, is what runs this thing called the Soviet Union. Stalin had the support of the party because he controlled a person's entry into the party. So, and, you know, the Communist Party in this new Soviet Union is basically the new elite. Yeah, the Communist Party is basically the new nobility. It's the new, you know, thing to be. And Stalin controlled acceptance into the party. So everybody who came into the party owed their membership in the Communist Party to Stalin. And that meant Stalin pretty much ran the party. Trotsky was removed from all offices, expelled from the party, exiled to Siberia, and finally expelled from Russia. And he moved to Mexico and was murdered in Mexico with his assassin. If you know what an ice pick is, an ice pick is something used to break up ice as a sharp point. His assassin stuck it in his ear. Pardon me. In 1940. Yeah, Stalin was killed, murdered in 1940. If you ever read the book Animal Farm by George Orwell, which in a lot of parts of the West, Animal Farm has been made into a cute children's story. But in Animal Farm, you have the pigs take over the farm. And the pigs are the Communist Party. And you have, let's see, Old Major, who represents a combination of Lenin and Karl Marx. And then you have Napoleon, who represents Stalin. And then you have Snowball, who represents Trotsky. And if you read the book, Snowball is ran off the farm by the dogs, and the dogs represent the KGB. After that, you lose track of whatever happened to Snowball. But what happened to Snowball, Trotsky, was that he was murdered in Mexico in 1940. Roman numeral 9. In 1919, the Soviet communists founded the Third International of the European Socialist Movement, the so-called Comintern. The Comintern wanted to make Leninist Marxism the model for all socialist parties outside the Soviet Union. In 1920, the Comintern imposed 21 conditions under which any other socialist organization would have to agree with for that socialist organization to join the so-called Comintern. That included acknowledging Moscow's leadership. In other words, if you were going to be part of this Comintern, whether you were Russian or not, whether you lived in Russia or not, you had to say, yeah, we're going to take orders from Moscow. Rejecting any reformist type of socialism or revisionist socialism. In other words, where the socialists would make compromises with the capitalist government, et cetera, et cetera. Repudiating previous socialist leaders and adopting the Communist Party name. The Comintern sought to destroy all democratic socialism. The decision as to join split every major socialist party in Europe. Yeah, some people wanted to join with their brothers in Soviet Union, and others wanted to once again compromise with the governments that was ruling their country. So throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the communists and social democrats fought each other more savagely than they fought capitalism or conservatism. Soviet political rhetoric aroused fears through every major European government, and political party was an easy target for the politicians. Okay, time to shift gears. Let us talk about fascism and Benito Mussolini. Yeah, Benito Mussolini, interesting character. I told you, and I think I've told all my classes, interesting fact about Benito Mussolini. I learned so much by watching television. But I was watching this thing about how dictators rise to power, and it appears that our friend, Mr. Mussolini, when he was 8 years old, he was expelled from school. Now, how do you get expelled from school when you're 8 years old? He had this nasty habit of stabbing his classmates with a knife. I mean, who does that? But yeah, that was Mussolini. That's the future fascist leader of Italy. Yeah. Can anyone say psychopath? Yeah. So most scholars agree that the term fascist, which you better believe, will be on your test. Fascist means anti-democratic, anti-parliamentary, and now here's the key one, anti-Marxist, anti-communist. Yeah, I mean, when we finally get to World War II, the Nazis and the fascists in Italy will consider their worst enemy, not the British, not the French, not the Americans, but the Russians, the Soviets, the communists. And it will be to the Nazis' great horror that it will be the communist Russians who first take over Berlin, who capture the city of Berlin. Anyway, in fact, the Nazis, and I'm off the subject now, the Nazis treated Russian POWs a lot differently than they did POWs from the other countries. And it wasn't good. So anyway, scholars agree fascist means anti-democratic, against democracy, anti-parliamentary, against legislators, anti-Marxist, and frequently anti-Semitic. They, the fascists, sought to make the world safe for the middle class, small businesses, owners of moderate amounts of property, and small farmers. Fascist regimes rejected the ideas of the French Revolution and of 19th century liberalism. They believed that parliaments sacrificed national goals to petty differences within the parliament. And you know what? There's some truth to that. I mean, if you don't believe it, watch Congress. Oftentimes, like for example, the passage of this aid bill, everybody agrees that this aid bill needed to happen, that Congress needed to put money into the hands of Americans so they could pay their rent. And what did they do? They quibbled, they argued, about details. And I'm not going to sit here and talk about who was right, who was wrong necessarily, but they argued about details of how to fit. And see, that's what parliamentary governments do. And then they get into political parties and they block votes and, they filibuster. And so, yeah, the fascists, they have a point about that. Fascist governments were usually single-party dictatorships characterized by terrorism and thuggish tactics, police tactics. They, the fascists, though, were rooted in the base of mass political parties. Roman numeral 11. Mussolini added his own brand of fascism. He had been the son of a blacksmith, a teacher, a day laborer, before entering politics. Mussolini became the editor of a newspaper called Avanti, which is Italian for forward. In 1914, he broke off with associates and promoted Italy's entry into the war on the side of the Allies, which they did in 1916. He lost his job with the newspaper Avanti, but soon formed his own newspaper, Il Popolo. Il Popolo d'Italia, which means the people of Italy. He could change his ideas, but his one real goal was political survival. After the war, after World War I, Italy was a mess. I mean, Italy was a mess before the war, but after the war, it was a worse mess. Parliament had ceased to function. Effectively, the ministers of each department, Department of Defense, Department of Finance, Department of the Interior, et cetera, ruled by decree. In other words, they ruled, they did their job. They just made up their own minds and went their own way. And many people, like the Germans, felt Italy had been cheated by the Treaty of Versailles. Because Italy, I mean, they were on the winning side, and they thought that after the war was over, if you look at the Adriatic Sea, that Italy would have gained what is called Italia Irredenta, that area of the Adriatic Sea that loops around. In other words, the Italians thought that they would own not only the western side of the Adriatic, they would own the part of the eastern side of the Adriatic too, where there was a large Italian population. But Italy was a mess. There was sectionalism. That means that the northern part of Italy had great disdain and hatred for the southern part of Italy, and the southern part of Italy felt the same way about the northern part of Italy. And then there's the old story in Italy that the trains didn't run on time. Prior to Mussolini, if you travel in Italy by train, a train was considered to be on time if that train arrived in the station within the same day as it was scheduled. And even in the early part of the 20th century, that was just, horrible. Trains arrived pretty much in most of the rest of the world within minutes before or after the times they were scheduled. They ran on time. That's how you run business. You run on time. But before Mussolini, trains arrived in the same day. And Mussolini, though, the old saying about Mussolini is Mussolini made the trains run on time. And you say, well, how do you do that? Answer, well, it was quite simple. If a train was late, Mussolini would have the conductor taken out and shot. And guess what? Trains ran on time after that. Now, yes, that they got the trains run on time, but at what cost did that happen? And so if you understand that, then you understand people's objection to Mussolini. He was a thug. He was a bully. He was a believer in, crushing people. So why don't we stop here, Roman numeral 11, part F, and we'll pick up Roman numeral 11, part F tomorrow. Tomorrow you have your quiz. Monday you'll have your test. I do hope everybody makes sure that they do their due diligence. Watch your emails. Look on Canvas daily. And not only do you watch Channel Horton, but for the World War I test, you have your terms and you have your take-home test, okay? Which the test will depend heavily upon that. All right? And so with that, I'm going to go and I'll bid you adieu until tomorrow. Stay safe, wash your hands, and I'm about to go do some serious sneezing. So thank you all very much. Goodbye now.